Good evening. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. First, there's a reception for the lecture in room 4300 after the lecture itself, sponsored by the AIAS and hosted by the Alumni Association. Secondly, immediately after that, for those that wish to attend, there's a wonderful exhibition in Gallery 400 here at the university entitled Through Amateur Eyes, and it's photographs, many of which have until now never been published, of the architecture of European modernism as photographed by an American abroad in 1931. And I think it's an exhibition that many of you will be interested in. Much of its focus is the Wiesenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart that Mies van der Rohe organized, including the work of Corbusier and others. Tonight's lecture is our second annual Eva Maddox Lecture in Interior Architecture, and Mr. and Mrs. Maddox are with us tonight, as she was last year, and we're very pleased to have them. The lecture began the lectureship, I should say, began as a part of the obligation that this architecture school undertakes willingly to engage interior architecture as well as its thrust into landscape architecture and urban design. In respect to that moving away from simply teaching architecture in the conventions by which most of you know it, which brings up tonight's lecture. It was always my view that to try to engage activities, intellectual activities included, between disciplines like interior architecture, landscape, urban design, and architecture itself. None of this will surprise any of you. If you look around, you'll see the kinds of people that have been teaching here, the theoreticians and so forth. But the subject that brings forth the lecturer tonight takes it yet another step, because it was, while it was going to be an obligation in the undergraduate program that in the fifth year a quarter would be devoted to the study of interiors, and indeed this winter quarter, Greg Landahl, who's with us tonight, is the visiting critic, doing a wonderful job accomplishing just those ends. It was felt that a prerequisite would be important for the students to engage in. And in line with that, rather than a prerequisite that dealt with the techniques of interiors, ergonomics and the like, I thought it would be important to try to build bridges with civilizing influences, I think was the conceit. And to that end, tonight's lecturer was asked to teach a course on basically the title of tonight's lecture, but it was on interior spaces, actually the literature of interior spaces. The course, in my judgment, was such a success that tonight's lecturer will also be doing it as a prerequisite this next year, in addition to repeating it, but will also be doing it as a prerequisite to landscape, where he'll do the literature of the land as well as the literature of the city as a prerequisite for urban design. So that sort of establishes how all of this came about in a certain way. Tonight's lecturer was educated at Northwestern, where he got his Bachelor of Arts, his Master's and doctorate in English Literature was at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He did a postdoctoral stint at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. His PhD dissertation was on the novels of George Eliot, a critical commentary. He has taught at the New School for Social Research in New York, was a teaching assistant at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, an instructor at Northwestern, has been a lecturer with great frequency at the Newberry Library, and most recently before here at Columbia College. Please help me welcome Bryan Fuermann.
this on right. I'm not very good at these things. Okay. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Nope. Higher? Okay. Before I begin, I'd like to make a couple of comments. In Alice in Wonderland, the story opens with Alice falling asleep because her sister is reading a book to her without any pictures. And I hope I do better than Alice's sister because there are no pictures tonight. It's going to be all words, and I ask that you try and use your visual imaginations to conjure up ideas of space that I'm going to read to you from literature, the way the writers used their literary imaginations to conjure up spaces that they garnered from architecture. And I put on the board two terms which may not be familiar to all of you. One is ut pictura poesis, picture poetry, and the other ut architectura poesis, or architectural poetry. They're two terms that one now uses in the field of interdisciplinary studies, and in case you didn't know them, I put them on the board. I'd like to begin by giving you some background into the field of ut architectura poesis and how I came to teach the course this fall. In the past 25 years, interdisciplinary studies relating literature to the visual arts has become a cottage industry in academia. Articles, dissertations, books, courses, even journals solely devoted to ut pictura poesis, the famous simile that Horace used in his Ars Poetica to describe how poetry influenced painting and painting affected poetry, are being published on a continuous basis, and the topic is now standard in art history and literature courses. We no longer can study the paintings of Turner without being familiar with the poetry of Byron and Scott and Shakespeare, whose poetry Turner not only illustrated, but appended alongside his canvases at the Royal Academy exhibitions, thus fusing poetry and painting in his art. To read Wordsworth and his call for a new order of poetry in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads requires that we look at the emergence of the peasant figure in early Romantic painting, and that we study Constable's landscapes of childhood, the visual equivalents of emotion recollected in tranquility. In Chapter 17 of Adam Bede, George Eliot proclaims her manifesto of realist fiction, telling her readers that she will present the life of the ordinary man, the unsung hero of modern times, in a manner similar to the Dutch painters, whose cabinet portraits of daily life serve as the model for her fiction. And when Virginia Woolf writes that she will, in her novels, portray life as a series of, quote, myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel, she, like Walter Pater before her, is attempting to do in fiction what the Impressionist painters did in paint. Present through words or dots of pigment myriad impressions which the reader or viewer must connect on his own in order to discern the reality before him on the page or on the canvas. We no longer study literature or art history in isolation, but seek cross-currents, generalizations about Geistgeschichte, investigate direct and indirect influences and their modes of transmission, pursue connections, and determine sources of inspiration that help us in better understanding the art of writing and of painting. But when we turn to the study of literature and architecture, however, it is an entirely different story. There are, surprisingly, only a few works of extensive scholarship in the field, a handful of first-rate articles, and certainly no journal that I know of devoted to ut architectura poesis, the influence of architecture on literature and its reverse. Why this has happened, I'm not sure, for a tradition of inner art between literature and architecture does exist. The Swedish critic Per Palma has shown that Vitruvius depended on Aristotle's Poetics, and the Aristotelian notion of harmony and concord in the human body and of unity in action is the source for his own principles of organic unity and harmony in architecture. A look at the writings of the English playwright Ben Jonson and the works of Inigo Jones will show that the 17th century was a period in which decorum of style and rules of language and diction not only paralleled but interconnected with the treatment of ornament and rules of style in mannerist architecture. There was, John Summerson points out in his classical language of architecture, a rhetoric of the Baroque. By the 19th century, formal connections between literature and architecture give way to more general associational correspondences. If Schelling calls architecture frozen music, Ruskin thinks of it in terms of literary constructs, entitling his first collection of essays, The Poetry of Architecture, and later asking us to begin to see buildings in terms of texts, to read a cathedral as if it were a book, written in a solemn language, whose every character is a work of art. Conversely, Henry James, in his preface to the 1908 New York edition of The Portrait of a Lady, tells us that he conceives of the new form of the novel, the house of fiction for which he is the master builder, not in literary but architectural terms. The novel, he says, is like a house of vast proportions, crafted in detail. And he goes on in the preface to give us a long, detailed description of the kind of house it is. The point here is not that James has a particular architectural style in mind, but that he thinks architecturally when discussing the craft of fiction. These examples, drawn from the small body of scholarship in the field of architecture and literature, suggest that much can be found and learned about how writers and architects think, create, interrelate. But at the moment, this particular area of interdisciplinary studies is, for all practical purposes, a tabula rasa. I point this out to you because when I began to prepare a course on interior space and the literary imagination, there was little in the way of scholarship or model courses to rely on for guidance. I had to create for myself certain guidelines in exploring the relationship of the two arts. Works of literature had to be selected that did not simply use interior space as background or setting, but dramatize these spaces as metaphors, images, analogs to other cross-current issues. The text had to open up to students who looked at problems of space from the practitioner's point of view, new and different ways of perceiving space from the point of view of the literary imagination. I needed to offer some justification for studying literature in an architecture course that went beyond simply enlarging a student's cultural life by showing how these two disciplines do in fact interrelate, enlarging perceptions of self in the extension of that self spatially, to focus on how the literary imagination dematerializes in words what the interior architect materializes in stone. What I propose tonight is to look at two of those texts, Alice in Wonderland, which is familiar to most of you and easy to follow, and Proust's Overture to Swann's Way, which is probably unfamiliar to many and difficult to follow because of Proust's labyrinthian style in his highly complex abstract thought. But we shall try anyway because it is so fantastic to read. And to suggest one way in which we might begin to study the relationship of architecture and literature. And what I'd like to do now is to suggest to you the approach or methodology that I took in the course, and one that I think we could take, or one could take in many other texts than the ones that we discussed in the class. In The Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard argues that all of us carry with us in our dreams, both day and night, our memories, remembered and forgotten, our fantasies, our fears, and our anxieties, images that situate spatially the various settings of our intimate selves. Each of us can describe through words or pictures where a dream or a nightmare occurs. Each of us, in our sexual fantasies, can locate the setting which excites. But too often we ignore the spatial dimension of our interior life and focus instead on other issues. Bachelard wishes to change this, suggesting that an analysis of the spatial components of our private thoughts will help us understand why we have feelings of nourishment, of shelter, orientation, and belonging, or conversely, of terror, disorientation, uprootedness, and of not belonging. He calls this analytic act Topo Analysis, and he suggests that one way we can begin to analyze systematically the sites of our interior being is by examining the spatial imagery, the spatial references, the spatial settings, in short, the spatial dynamics of literature, which can evoke through the imaginative power of language, through words, images, metaphors, descriptions of dream states, not only the mood and meaning and associations of the setting of a text, but can offer through artistic transference insight into the moods and meanings and associations of our own interior beings, into the spatial images that are lodged in our unconsciousnesses, housed in our memories, and which affect the way we live and design spatially. Begin to look at the imagery of doors, windows, attics, cellars, bedrooms, chimneys, hearths, cells, prisons, enclosures. In short, the architectural components of literature, and you will, Bachelor argues, begin to understand the architectural components of the mind, and by implication, the psychological dimension of the architecture one inhabits daily, in which one designs professionally. To study architecture in literature, to engage in literary topo analysis, as I shall now do with Alice and Proust, offers one direction for the study of ut architectura poesis. On July the 4th, 1862, on a rowing trip up the Thames near Oxford, the Reverend Charles Dotson, mathematician, logician, Oxford Don, ordained deacon, punster, and confirmed bachelor, whose principal hobby in life seems to have been entertaining little girls, whose naked bodies he found extremely beautiful and loved to photograph, told a story to Alice Liddell, the young, beautiful daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, whose affection and attention he hoped to obtain through his imaginative rendering of another Alice's journey, not up a river, but down a rabbit's hole. The author, of course, is Lewis Carroll, and his story is Alice in Wonderland, one of those wonderfully complicated works of children's literature whose marvelous descriptions of nonsense have offered critics and Alice readers the opportunity for multiple interpretations: political, metaphysical, religious, allegorical, Freudian. But as far as I know, no one has focused on the topo-analytical aspects of Carroll's story, his rendering of spatial imagery and spatial references which offer us a keyhole clue to what this frightening Victorian children's story is all about. The story begins with young Alice lapsing into daydream out of boredom over a book her sister is reading to her. As she starts falling asleep, she notices, as only in dreams, a white rabbit with a waistcoat and a watch chain running by. Being curious, she chases after it, falling into a rabbit hole underneath a nearby hedge. This fall for Alice down a long, long hole becomes a journey for her into a world which will challenge her assumptions about class, about reason and logic, about her own biology and her relationship with animal life, about time, and about space. And for the first half of Alice's story, up to the famous encounter with the Cheshire Cat, these assumptions are largely conveyed to us in architectural ways. As Alice lapses into her dream, Carroll immediately situates her Oniric state spatially. She passes by objects of a familiar domestic nature: cupboards, bookshelves, pictures hung on pegs. She imagines that if she can cope with this fall, she'll have no trouble falling down the stairs at home. And she wonders as she falls farther and farther into an imaginary center of the earth what longitude and latitude she is at. Not because she knows the meaning of these words, she doesn't, for she is, after all, a little girl, but because they were such nice grand words to say. Suddenly she hits bottom, a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and notices the white rabbit, the elusive object of her quest, running down another long, dark passage, which she immediately pursues until she finds herself and I'm going to give you this quote, in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. There were doors all around the hall, but they were all locked. And when Alice had been all the way down one side and up the other, trying every door, she walked sadly down the middle, wondering how she was ever to get out again. Suddenly she came upon a little three-legged table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it but a tiny golden key. And Alice's first idea was that this might belong to one of the doors of the hall. But alas, either the locks were too large or the key was too small. But at any rate, it would not open any of them. However, on the second time round, she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight, it fitted. Alice opened the door and found that it led into a small passage, not much larger than a rat hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander about among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains, and she could not even get her there through the doorway. And even if my head would go through, thought poor Alice, it would be of very little use without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could shut up like a telescope. I think I could if I only knew how to begin. For you see, so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. What Carol is doing here is relying on images and references of the familiar domestic interior space of a Victorian parlor, and juxtaposing them with the threatening, darker world of Alice's unconscious, symbolized by the hole and the dark passage and the subterranean hall. Alice is in a world of enclosure, of spatial entrapment, a world where architectural elements, locked doors, and claustrophobic spaces threaten her. And she seeks escape to a lovely garden, seen through a keyhole, where she can regain the peace and security of childhood and innocence. But because the entrance to the garden is too small, Alice, in a state of panic, drinks an unidentifiable substance and finds herself shrinking to 10 inches, the right size to get through the door. Unfortunately, she has forgotten to take with her, in her miniaturization, the golden key on the top of the glass table. To keep from crying over her predicament, she eats a small cake, and to her surprise, she begins to grow, taller and taller, until her head strikes the roof of the hall, until she envelops much of the space around her. Her situation is hopeless, too small, too large, too many locked doors, and like all little girls, or little boys for that matter, who find themselves in frightening rooms and uncontrollable situations, she begins to cry, filling her spatial hole with a pool of tears that will eventually sweep her out of her prison and onto the shore of Wonderland. William Empson, whose Freudian analysis of Alice still remains the best critical work ever written on Carol's story, suggests that in her dream, Alice becomes her father in getting down the hole, her own fetus at the bottom, and can only be born by becoming her own mother and producing her own amniotic fluid, symbolized by her tears. Well, this is stretching analysis a little too far for my taste. It reminds me of what Martin Gardner wrote on Alice, and I think this is a fabulous quote. Alice's adventures in Wonderland should not be allowed to circulate indiscriminately among adults who are undergoing analysis. I think a better way to describe the situation is to suggest that Carol, like so many authors of Honoric literature, Kafka in The Castle, Coleridge in Kubla Khan, James in Turn of the Screw, relies on spatial imagery and architectural elements, deep wells, locked doors, golden keys, Victorian tables, garden views, long dark hallways, to situate her dream state, to convey her fear of feeling dislocated, her anxiety at not only feeling entrapped, but having her assumptions about space threaten her identity. As she sits in her pool of tears, Alice asks, "Dear, dear, how queer everything is today. and yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've changed in the night. Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle. And that becomes the key question, the principal theme, if you will, of the Alice story. Who is she? Why is she changing, biologically and psychologically? Where is she? Why does she feel so displaced and dislocated and disproportionate spatially to the world around her? How can she adjust to this change in life? Why can't the assumptions of the real world apply in the dream world? How can she get to the garden, that permanent symbol of paradise and godly security that will save her? In Alice, the architectural components of Wonderland become extensions of the architecture of Alice's mind, of her dream, of the structure of her unconscious. In Alice, the question, where am I, becomes, who am I, as it does for all of us when we find ourselves in interiors that make us feel uneasy, that tap into our interior insecurities and buried fears. What makes Alice's situation so vivid is that Carroll and his wonderful illustrator, John Tenniel, have made the spatial dimension of her story so vivid that we can feel for Alice and understand her insecurity. After leaving the great caucus race of animals and fish that Alice finds herself in when swept ashore on her own tears, a race, by the way, that is run in a circle with no start or finish, no entrance or exit, no question or answer, Alice picks up the trail of the white rabbit and follows him to his house, where she unabashedly enters, and in which she runs upstairs to see what this rabbit is all about. There, out of curiosity, for one of Alice's great traits is being like her cat, Dinah, curious, Alice drinks another unknown substance, with the result that she begins to change size again, this time getting so large that, quote, she found her head pressing against the ceiling and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, that's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more. As it is, I can't get out at the door. Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing and growing, very soon had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute, there was not even room for this, and she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door and the other arm curled round her head. Still, she went on growing, and as a last resort, she put one arm out the window, one foot up the chimney, and said to herself, now I can do no more. Whatever happens, what will become of me? Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still, it was very uncomfortable, and as there seemed to be no sort of chance of her ever getting out of the room again, no wonder she felt unhappy. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down that rabbit hole, and yet, it's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. In this passage, Carroll has Alice literally becoming the room she is inhabiting. She is anthropomorphizing the space she is in with her foot up the chimney, her eyes becoming windows, and her elbows a door, which the little animals who inhabit the house cannot open. Alice finds the situation interesting, if not very comfortable, and carries on a wonderful dialogue with herself about where she is and what will become of her. But the white rabbit and his friends are not amused and begin to attack her for taking over their space. This attack, like so many others from the animal life in Wonderland, suggests the presence of Charles Darwin, whose Origin of the Species was published in 1859, 3 years before Alice was created, and whose theory of evolution was very much in the Oxford air. I mention Darwin here in conjunction with a talk on architecture and literature, because the only way Alice will learn to survive in Wonderland, to deal successfully with the nonsense and often brutal attacks she encounters, is to adapt spatially, to become proportionately fit to the ever-shifting scale of the houses and landscapes of her dream. As she says to herself after escaping from the white rabbit's house by eating another cake which helps her shrink, the first thing I've got to do, said Alice to herself as she wandered about in the wood, is to grow to my right size again, And the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan. Alice's luck turns when she runs into a caterpillar smoking a hookah who asks her, "Who are you?" I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then. The caterpillar interrogates Alice a little further, asking her, "What size do you want to be?" it asked. "Oh, I'm not particular as to size," Alice replied. "Only one doesn't like changing so often, you know." "I don't know," said the caterpillar. "Are you content now?" "Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind," said Alice. 3 inches is such a wretched height to be." "It's a very good height indeed," said the caterpillar angrily, rearing itself upright as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. "But I'm not used to it," pleaded poor Alice. And she thought to herself, "I wish the creatures wouldn't get so easily offended." "You'll get used to it in time," said the caterpillar. And the way she does get used to it is through the caterpillar's gift of a magic mushroom, one side of which makes her smaller, the other side larger. Learning to lick the right amounts of mushroom to become the right size, to get in and out of the houses and tea parties and croquet matches, to get in and out of situations, to get in and out of her own mind, becomes Alice's task, her method for survival through the remainder of her story. Once she learns to adapt spatially, she learns to exercise some control over her situation and her moods and her responses to them. The encounters become less threatening to her, and the story changes from spatial nightmare to playful fancy. Other spatial references occur in Alice, but the ones which we have looked at, the ones which convey Alice's dislocation from the safe world of the Victorian parlor, her uprootedness, her feelings of not belonging, of not fitting in, literally and Darwiningly, her anxieties and fears about the threatening interior spaces she is inhabiting, her questions of identity, and of her learning to adapt spatially according to the rules of survival in the world of Wonderland, are the principal ones on which Carol relied to situate spatially the intimate dreams of this young, innocent, physically changing, indomitable little heroine. Although this topo analysis of Alice is not the only method one can use to uncover some of the meaning of this hauntingly strange story, I believe it offers one clear way of bringing sense to Carol's nonsense, of finding some logic in the illogic of her spatial situation, and of explaining the source of Alice's discomfort and the way she learns architecturally to resolve the spatial challenges presented to her. It is not surprising that Peter Eisenman should have noted Alice's adventures in his class a few years ago, for Alice in many ways parallels issues central to deconstructivist architecture. As Mark Wrigley writes in his essay on deconstructivist architecture from the 1988 Museum of Modern Art catalog, this is an architecture of disruption, dislocation, deflection, deviation, and distortion, rather than one of demolition, dismantling, decay, decomposition, or disintegration. It displaces structure instead of destroying it. This produces a feeling of unease, of disquiet, because it challenges the sense of stable, coherent identity that we associate with pure form. It is as if perfection had always harbored imperfection. What Wrigley singles out in his description of deconstructivist architecture, disruption, dislocation, distortion, the feelings of unease and disquiet that result when identity is threatened, could be a description of Carol's rendering of interior space in Alice. Both Carol and the deconstructivist architects address the issue of identity. Alice's in unknown spaces, traditional architecture when invaded by new forms. Each seeks to uncover the demons that lie buried beneath the surface. In Alice's case, the demons of the unconscious, which threaten in all of their spatial transformations the complacent, fragile stability of her Victorian sensibility. In architecture, the alien parasites of impure forms that lie latently present until the architect releases them and makes them one symbiotic entity with traditional form. Issues that may seem Victorian can, if we look topo-analytically at Alice, have a peculiarly contemporary edge to them. Personally, I like to see another connection between Alice and deconstructivist architecture, one in the spirit of Carroll's nonsense. Looking at the buildings in the 1988 MoMA exhibition, one can imagine these architects attending the Mock Turtles University. At his school, he tells Alice, he had to study reeling and writhing, and then the different branches of arithmetic: ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. I never heard of uglification, Alice ventured to say. What is it? The griffin lifted up both of its paws in surprise. Never heard of uglifying, it explained. You know what to beautify is, I suppose. Yes, said Alice doubtfully. It means to make anything prettier. Well then, the griffin went on, if you don't know what to uglify is, you are a simpleton. Judging from their design, some of these architects would pass with flying colors at the Mock Turtles' alma mater. "50 years after Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland, Marcel Proust, neurotic, asthmatic, Jew, sodomite, voyeur of French social manners, finished the first volume of his 7-volume novel A la recherche du temps perdu, a work, George Steiner remarks, that was written in one long breath. Simply put, Things Past is the story of how a little boy named Marcel, whom we shall look at tonight, becomes a writer. But the novel is really much more than this. It is the biography of the novelist, Marcel Proust, written by himself, who has decided to write his life story not as an autobiography, but as a novel, in which the novel he describes himself as writing is the biography he is now writing. It's all very complicated, and to make matters worse, although the central theme of Proust's monumental work is nothing less than the rescue of the self from the oblivion of time, the introduction to Things Past, Proust's Overture to Swann's Way, is almost entirely spatial. It is, in fact, one of the great works of literary architecture appended to one of the great works on the meaning of time. Proust's Overture situates us in another world from that of Alice, the world of half-dreams, the period just after sleep when our sense of being lacks a definition of self, when we seek through some identification with the external space around us a sense of connection to the real world, a rescuing of the self from the oblivion of non-being which sleep conveys. For the narrator of Proust's story, that space, appropriately, is his bedroom, the room to which Proust himself retreated in 1910 for the remainder of his life, 12 years, to write in cloistered, cork-lined silence his autobiographical novel. And it is in his depiction of the ameliorative effects of the interior space of a bedroom on the narrator's mind, in his detailed analysis of the meaning of interior space on the formations of the self, that Proust comes closer than any author I know in achieving a poetics of space in Bachelardian terms. Proust's treatise on space begins with his unnamed narrator awakening prematurely from sleep, incapable of focusing on reading, letting his mind free associate about strangers traveling on trains to their homes and on invalids who, like himself, must wait out the night till the light of day rescues them from the anxiety of being left alone in bed, ignored and unattended to. As he lays in bed, staring into darkness, he tells us, I would be awake again for short snatches only, just long enough to open my eyes to settle the shifting kaleidoscope of darkness, to savor sleep which lay heavy upon the furniture, the room, the whole surroundings of which I formed but an insignificant part, in whose unconsciousness I should very soon return to share. To the narrator, the room and its furniture, those separate physical entities, share with him the same space. Sleep falls on the objects as well as on the narrator, and together they lapse into one shared unconsciousness at night. The awakening from this shared sleep is a slow process for the narrator, a process of locating himself spatially and architecturally, of letting his mind adapt to the myriad layers of space in which it finds itself as it journeys from unconscious sleep to the light of waking reality. And now I'm going to give you an example of Proust's prose style. I beg your patience here. When a man is asleep, he writes, he has in a circle round him the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, the order of the heavenly host. Instinctively, when he awakes, he looks to these and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface and the amount of time that has elapsed during his slumbers. For me, it was enough if, in my own bed, my sleep was so heavy as completely to relax my consciousness, for then I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep. And when I woke up at midnight, not knowing where I was, I could not be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute of human qualities than the cave dweller. But then memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived, would come like a rope, let down from heaven, to draw me up out of the abyss of non-being from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash, I would put together by degrees the component parts of my ego. I left out about 14 or 15 lines. That's all one sentence. But it's also, I think, incredible. Like Alice, the narrator here tells us that since he is not sure where he is because of sleep, he is not sure who he is. For him, awareness of space and awareness of self are inseparable, and the process to restoring his full being, of reclaiming his ego, is a spatial journey requiring for him the Humpty Dumpty act of putting together all the separate spatial components of his mind that are now fragmented in the abyss of non-being, in cave dwelling, and in the memory of other spaces, but which need to be composed into a clear picture of the real space in which he now awakes. Before achieving this goal, however, the narrator tells us that random thoughts about other rooms in which he had slept, rooms in Paris or in the country, alone or with someone, would flash through his memory, and with them the feelings he would associate with those spaces, the feelings, for instance, of nesting, when he would build up out of the most diverse materials the corner of his pillow, the top of his blankets, a piece of shawl, the edge of his bed, and a copy of the evening paper, all of which would contrive, with the infinite patience of birds building their nests, his own little nest in which to sleep. Or of feeling snug under the covers near a fire in a sort of alcove, creating a cave of warmth dug out of the heart of the room. Or the feeling of dislocation that comes when staring at a mirror in a dark room and the mind leaves its moorings and elongates itself upwards so as to take on the exact shape of the room. As these detailed passages show, in Proust, interior spaces shape, control, define, extend, orient the self. They become sources of memory, of imaginative inquiry, of feeling, and of self-analysis. For the narrator, the struggle of waking up, of locating where he is, of piecing together the jumble of associational thoughts which rooms evoke, of cementing into one whole, like his nesting pillow, a clear perception of the space around him, becomes the central act in defining who he is. Architecture saves him from loss of self. It also becomes the symbol of the psychic trauma that nearly destroys him. As a young boy, Marcel's bedroom became the fixed point on which his melancholy and anxious thoughts were centered when he would have to go to bed and lie there, unsleeping, far from his mother and grandmother, for whom he had an obsessive dependency. To keep from being tortured by his isolation, Marcel succeeds in filling his bedroom with objects that reflect his own personality, and with recurring nightly thoughts that help him think no more of the space around him than he thinks of himself. For Marcel, his bedroom is both a source of daily, predestined pain, allayed by the exquisite ritual of his mother's nightly kiss, and a knowing solace because of the anesthetic effect custom and familiarity play on his psychology. Two events change forever Marcel's perception of that space. The first occurs when a friend of the family gives him a magic lantern, a lamp which, quote, in the manner of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days, creates impalpable, iridescent, supernatural phenomena of many colors on his walls. For Marcel, this change of lighting, merely increases his sorrow, for it destroys, as nothing else could have done, the customary impressions he had learned to form of his room, impressions thanks to which, he tells us, the room itself, but for the torture of having to go to bed in it, had become quite endurable. Thereafter, the curtains, the door handles, the light on the walls, the windows, take on the alien expressions of change, and his bedroom no longer conveys necessary familiarity. It becomes to him like a room in a hotel or a room with furnished lodgings. To young Marcel, this fear of change in the interior spaces in which he dwells, this dependency on custom to make each space conform to his neurotic personality, is never outgrown. Commenting on the many bedrooms in which he will sleep over the years, each night he climbs the hateful staircase whose varnish reminds him of his exile from affection and affirmation. But this night the varnish invades his consciousness in a manner more rapid and instantaneous, a manner at once insidious and brutal. Once in his room, Marcel becomes a prisoner, tortured by denial. He closes the shutters, digs his own grave as he turns down the bedclothes, and wraps himself in the shroud of his nightshirt. The rest of the night he lays in his prison bedroom, hoping, praying, strategizing for his jailer to release him from his anxiety through her kiss. In the end, Mama does come to Marcel, staying the night in his room, sensing that her young son will become the invalid to which he compares himself later in life. What is important here is that in Proust, as in Plato, the interior spaces in which Marcel dwells, the physicality of the walls and ceilings and objects that define them, become solipsistic extensions of the mind and of the isolated self that perceives them. To young Marcel, bedrooms become prisons, hospitals, sanatoriums, and only when ritual and custom coincide do they become refuge and home. Many years will pass after this, years of repressing the trauma of abandonment and of losing a parent's esteem, years in which other bedrooms will become scenes for lovemaking, for sodomy, for searching out for, but never satisfactorily finding, what was lost this one night. Until one day, when dipping a little Madeleine cookie in lime-scented tea, Marcel remembers how his grandmother used to serve him the same cookie and tea, and slowly, inevitably, mysteriously, religiously, Marcel begins to remember his past and the rooms in which he has slept. His repression begins to release itself, and his notion of self changes. Quote, I place in position before my mind's eye the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been embedded like an anchor at a great depth. I can measure the resistance. I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed, the vast structures of recollection unfold. Great spaces traversed, vast structures of recollection. These wonderfully cosmic, architectonic images conjure up the real, remembered, imagined spaces Marcel has lived in, the bedrooms we have looked at. But they also serve as Proustian metaphors for the layers of space that define Marcel's mind, the spaces that lie buried in his psyche, that define his self and his perceptions, the material spaces that surround him, which his imagination will dematerialize into words and associations and feelings conveyed in the 7 volumes of text he will now begin to write about his life, in which we, concluding the Overture, will begin to read. Alice in Wonderland and Proust's Overture are very different stories. The one, a Victorian children's story about a little girl who falls asleep easily. The other, one of the great works of modern adult fiction about a boy and a man who have trouble falling asleep. Yet both raise questions that are essentially architectural. Questions about what our dreams and half-dreams look like spatially, about how our relationship to the spatial components of our dreams address issues about our identities that can be transferred into the spatial dimensions of our waking life, about how spaces that convey dislocation, disproportion, disquiet can play a significant role in the formation and evolution of ourselves, about how the concrete material reality of architecture shapes the definition of the self, about how the physicality of space can be seen as less real than the perception of that space, as Plato in the allegory of the cave and Proust argue, about how architecture is necessary to the formation of the ego. These questions concerning the metaphysics of space, the memory of space, the perception of space, the psychology of space, which are generally regarded as the provenance of architecture, are, as we have seen tonight, central to literature as well. For the writer, they help shape setting, characterization, literary structure, moral and philosophical issues. For the architect, they affect issues of proportion, spatial arrangement, mood, psychological and ideological context, actual and imagined perceptions. From architecture, the writer draws images, symbols, models for verbal constructs, modes of description to convey his themes. From literature, the architect draws in new ways of thinking and perceiving about himself in his self's perception and execution of space. What these interconnections demonstrate is that ut architectura poesis is a subject worth pursuing in literary criticism and in architectural theory. The focus tonight has been on the literary side. I would like to balance this equation in concluding by quoting from the Seven Lamps of Architecture. Discussing the lamp of memory, John Ruskin eloquently describes how he feels about the relationship of poetry to architecture. Architecture, Ruskin writes, is to be regarded by us with the most serious thought. We can live without her and worship without her, but we cannot remember without her. The ambition of the old Babel builders was well directed for this world. There are but two strong conquerors of the forgetfulness of men, poetry and architecture, and the latter in some sort includes the former, and is mightier in its reality. It is well to have not only what men have thought and felt, but what their hands have handled, and their strength wrought, and their eyes beheld all the days of their life. Thank you very much.